The ring hit the dirt floor of the Silver Pine Saloon at exactly the moment Delia Larson's voice abandoned her completely. It was a simple band of gold, catching the afternoon light that poured through the saloon's wide-open doors, and it rolled in a slow, lazy arc before settling at the toe of her boot. The entire town of Harrow Creek had gone silent. Every man with a whiskey glass had set it down. Every woman who had stepped in from the street to see what the commotion was had pressed a hand to her chest. Children peered around their mothers' skirts. The piano player had lifted both hands from the keys as though the instrument had burned him. Marshal Preston Navarro stood in the center of it all, one knee still on the rough plank floor, his hat in his hand. His dark eyes fixed on Delia with an expression that was unlike anything she had ever seen on his face before. That face, which had always been composed and unreadable and faintly dangerous, was cracked wide open. There was nothing hidden in it now. There was nothing guarded or strategic. There was only him, stripped of every defense he had ever constructed, asking her the most impossible question she had ever been asked. "Delia Larson," he had said, his voice carrying across the entire room without him raising it even a fraction, because Preston Navarro never needed to raise his voice to be heard. "I am asking you in front of every soul in this town to be my wife." And she could not speak, not a single syllable, not a breath. The words she needed were somewhere inside her, buried under years of secrets she had carried alone, buried under the dark past she had never trusted anyone enough to confess, buried under the one terrible truth that could make this entire moment collapse into ash and betrayal and ruin. The ring was at her feet. The man she loved more than she had ever allowed herself to love anything was on his knee before her, and the whole town was watching. And she could not speak. She had known, 3 months earlier, that something like this was always going to be impossible. Harrow Creek sat in the lower belly of New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1879, a town that had been fighting for its own survival since the day the first nail was hammered into the first building along its single main street. The railroad had promised to come through, and had not come. The cattle drive still brought enough commerce to keep the general store and the saloon and the small doctor's office alive, but just barely. The population hovered somewhere between 300 and 400 souls depending on the season, and everyone knew everyone with the kind of intimate familiarity that made privacy nearly impossible and gossip nearly inevitable. Delia had arrived in Harrow Creek in January of that year, coming off the stage from Santa Fe with one leather trunk, one carpet bag, and the sort of calm, contained expression that people who have survived genuinely terrible things often wear as a second skin. She was 26 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned sensibly at the back of her neck. Her eyes were a complicated shade of green that shifted toward gray when she was angry or frightened. And she was, in those first days in Harrow Creek, frequently frightened, though she would not have shown it to anyone. She had taken the position as the new schoolteacher, replacing a man named Mr. Coverley, who had departed for California with considerably less dignity than he had arrived with, owing to a dispute over a card game that Preston Navarro had resolved with the kind of efficiency that had made him legendary in 3 territories. Preston Navarro had been the Marshal of Harrow Creek for 4 years when Delia arrived. He was 31. He was originally from a small ranching family outside of Taos, the son of a Mexican father and an Anglo mother, and he had grown up navigating the particular kind of double suspicion that fell on people who fit too neatly in neither world. He had learned early that the best way to earn respect in a place that was reluctant to give it was to be so genuinely, undeniably good at his work that even the most stubborn men in town could not find a reasonable argument against him. And he was extraordinary at his work. The crime in Harrow Creek had dropped considerably since he had pinned on his star. He was methodical. He was honest. He was the kind of man who said exactly what he meant and followed through on every word, a quality so rare in 1879 New Mexico territory that it bordered on extraordinary. He had noticed Delia the morning she arrived, because it was his habit to notice everyone who came off the stage. He stood on the covered boardwalk outside his office and watched the passengers climb down, cataloging each of them automatically, the way he had trained himself to do. The traveling merchant with the wide sample case. The elderly couple who appeared to be returning from somewhere rather than arriving somewhere. And then Delia, who stepped down from the coach with her trunk and her bag and looked up at the street of Harrow Creek with those changeable green eyes, and something in her expression that Preston, even from across the street, recognized immediately. He recognized it because he had worn the same expression himself, years before, when he had arrived in a place he was not sure would accept him. The expression of someone who has decided to try anyway, despite having excellent reasons not to. He had not approached her that morning. He had simply watched her collect her trunk and make her way toward the general store, where she had been told to ask for directions to the boarding house. He had watched, and then he had gone back inside his office, and he had thought about that expression for the rest of the day in the way a man thinks about something he does not yet know the name for. Their first actual conversation came 4 days after her arrival, when Delia came to his office to report that someone had broken the window of the schoolhouse. It was a petty piece of vandalism, likely the work of one of the older boys who had not been pleased about the new teacher's policy on tardiness. Preston had sat behind his desk and listened to her describe the damage with his hands folded and his full attention on her face, and he had noticed that she described everything with a precision that was unusual. She gave him exact dimensions. She told him the angle of the break and what it suggested about the direction the stone had been thrown. She told him she had found boot prints that were too large to belong to any of her younger students and could be narrowed down to perhaps 3 or 4 boys of the right age and foot size. "You have done half my work for me," he had said. "I taught myself to observe carefully," she had replied. "It is a useful skill." "It is," he had agreed. And then, because he was Preston Navarro and did not waste words, he had said, "You have been somewhere that required you to be very careful." It was not exactly a question, and she had looked at him across the cluttered desk with those shifting green eyes and said, very steadily, "Haven't most people out here?" He had let it go. But he had filed it away. The window was replaced. The culprit, a 16-year-old named Hector Briggs who had more energy than sense, was made to pay for the glass from his own wages and to spend 2 Saturdays helping clean the schoolhouse. Delia had not asked for punishment beyond that. She had asked, which surprised Preston, for Hector to be treated with dignity in the process, because she suspected, she said, that the boy's problem was not malice but boredom and the particular restless desperation of a young man with no clear direction. Preston had thought about that for several days afterward. He was not accustomed to people in distress worrying about the dignity of the person who had wronged them. The friendship between them had built slowly, the way things build in a place where trust is earned by accumulation rather than gesture. He began stopping by the schoolhouse in the evenings after the students had gone, ostensibly to check on the repaired window, but really because Delia was often still there at her desk correcting work by lamplight, and their conversations had begun to develop a quality that Preston found himself looking forward to in a way that unsettled him pleasantly. She was extraordinarily well read. She had opinions on everything from agricultural policy to the philosophy of law that she expressed without apology, but also without arrogance, willing to be challenged and willing to change her mind when presented with a compelling argument. She made him think harder than he was accustomed to thinking outside of his professional work, and that was genuinely rare. He also noticed, over those weeks, that she deflected personal questions with the kind of practiced ease that suggested long rehearsal. She would redirect a conversation about her past into a conversation about the topic itself, so that a question about where she had grown up somehow became a fascinating discussion about the differences in farming practice between Missouri and the territories. And before you knew it, 20 minutes had passed, and she had told you everything except what you had originally asked. Preston noticed this. He also noticed that she relaxed, visibly and incrementally in his company, that the tension she carried in her shoulders on most occasions was somewhat less when she was talking to him, that she laughed more genuinely with him than he observed her laughing with anyone else in town, that she had taken to saving particularly interesting articles from the Santa Fe newspaper for him and leaving them on the corner of her desk when she knew he would be stopping by. He did not push the deflections. He had his own things he did not easily discuss. He had learned that pressing at someone's hidden places too directly usually just drove them to hide more deeply, and he was, above all things, a patient man. February passed, and March arrived with a warmth that was deceptive. Harrow Creek had a quiet kind of beauty in early spring, the mountains visible to the north still wearing their white caps, the desert floor just beginning to show the first cautious greens of new growth. Preston had begun riding out toward the schoolhouse on Sunday mornings with a second horse, suggesting, very casually, that the country around Harrow Creek was worth seeing and that he knew the best routes, and that she was welcome to come along if she chose. She had come along the first Sunday, with the wariness of someone accepting an offered hand without yet being certain whether it was safe to trust it. She was a capable rider, which surprised him slightly, though he was not sure why it should have. By the third Sunday, she rode beside him with the ease of someone who had decided the hand was safe, and they talked for hours about things that had nothing to do with secrets or dark pasts, or the particular loneliness that both of them had been carrying for longer than was good for anyone. It was on one of those Sunday rides in late March that he first felt the full weight of what was happening to him. They had stopped on a ridge that overlooked the valley below the town, the horses drinking from a shallow stream, the sky enormous and deeply blue above them. Delia had climbed down from the saddle and was standing at the edge of the ridge with her arms crossed loosely, looking out over the distance with an expression of unguarded peace that he had never seen on her face in town. She looked, in that moment, as though she had put something down, as though some long-carried weight had been, for just a moment, set on the ground beside her, and Preston, standing slightly behind her with the reins of both horses in his hand, had felt something shift in his chest with the finality of a key turning in a lock. He recognized it immediately, and it frightened him, and he was grateful that she was facing away from him, and could not see what was certainly visible on his face. He had been careful after that. He had told himself to be careful. There were very good reasons to be careful, not least of which was the fact that he had no certainty about what her situation was. She had come from somewhere. She had left something behind or been driven from something. The careful intelligence she had about protecting her own history, the way she watched the stage arrivals with an attention that mirrored his own professional vigilance, the fact that she never sent letters through the local post, but instead occasionally made trips to Santa Fe that she described only as errands. All of these things told a story he did not have the words to, and he knew better than most people what unresolved stories could do. He did not stop seeing her. He could not have done that even if he had genuinely wanted to, and he did not genuinely want to, but he held himself to a kind of discipline. He was her friend. He was her honest, steady, uncomplicated friend. He protected that space fiercely because he believed, or tried to believe, that it was the right thing. April brought the trouble. It arrived on a Tuesday on the afternoon stage in the form of a man named Gerald Cross. Preston was in his office when the stage came in, but he saw Cross through the window because his office faced the main street, and he had an unobstructed view of the stage stop. Cross was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, with the kind of deliberate physical presence that some men cultivate specifically to intimidate. He wore a good suit that was slightly too heavy for the warming weather, and he stepped off the stage and stood on the street and looked slowly along the length of it, with the manner of a man who has arrived somewhere with a purpose he considers already accomplished. Preston did not like him on sight, which was a thing he generally tried not to trust and generally found himself right about anyway. Cross took a room at the boarding house where Delia also had a room. Preston learned this from Mrs. Adler, who ran the boarding house and who came to tell him, with the gentle urgency of a woman who had developed a finely calibrated instinct for trouble, that the new man had asked, very particularly, which room belonged to the schoolteacher. Preston was at the boarding house within 20 minutes of receiving this information. He found Delia in the small parlor that Mrs. Adler provided for her guests, and the moment he walked through the door and she saw his face, whatever remaining color was in her own face left it entirely. She understood without him having to say anything that something had found her. "What is his name?" she asked before he said a word. "Gerald Cross." She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them, and the fear that had briefly shone in them was replaced by something harder and colder and deeply determined. "How long ago did he arrive?" "Within the hour." "He has taken a room here. He asked about your room specifically." Preston kept his voice level. "Tell me what I need to know." And she told him. Not everything, not the full depth of it, but enough. Gerald Cross was from Kansas City. He had been, for the past several years, the business partner of a man named Thomas Larson, who had been Delia's husband. The word husband sat between them in the quiet parlor like a stone dropped into still water, and Preston absorbed it without expression, because he had trained himself well, and because he understood that this was not the moment for anything except listening. Thomas Larson had been dead for 14 months. He had died in a dispute that had, in the official record, been described as a robbery gone wrong in a Kansas City alleyway. In the unofficial reality, which Delia described to Preston in a steady voice that betrayed the cost of steadiness, Thomas Larson had been involved in a scheme with Gerald Cross that involved falsifying land titles across 3 territories, a scheme that had ultimately defrauded dozens of settlers of their claims and their savings. Thomas had grown a conscience at the wrong moment and had expressed it in a letter to a federal territorial judge. Before the letter could be delivered, he was dead. Delia had known, before the body was cold, exactly what had happened and why. She had also known, with the clarity of someone who understands the mathematics of survival, that she was next on the list if she was found to have read the letter, or if she was believed to possess any other knowledge that could connect Cross to the fraud or to the murder. She had left Kansas City within a week of Thomas's death. She had moved carefully, changing towns, teaching school when she could find the work because she had been a schoolteacher before her marriage, and because it was respectable work that explained a woman traveling alone. She had been in Santa Fe for 6 months, then in a small town east of Albuquerque, and then she had come to Harrow Creek, which was remote enough and quiet enough that she had begun, cautiously, to believe she might have found somewhere that Cross could not easily reach. She had been wrong. "He has come for me," she said, with a calm that was the bravest thing Preston had ever heard. "Either because he believes I have evidence or testimony that can damage him, or because he wishes to eliminate the last person who knew about Thomas's letter." Preston sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "Is there evidence?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes." "Where?" "Safe. Not in this town," he nodded. "All right." He stood. "You are not going to be alone until this is resolved. You are not going to have a conversation with this man without me present, or without your express choosing of that. And you are going to trust me." It was the last part that he held her gaze for. And she held it back, those green eyes level and searching and reading him the way she had been reading him for 3 months, all the small accumulated evidence of his character and his steadiness. "I trust you," she said. And that, though neither of them knew it yet, was the moment everything truly began. Gerald Cross made his approach the following morning. He appeared at the schoolhouse door during the noon break, when the children were eating their lunches outside in the April warmth, and Delia was alone inside. He had not anticipated, or had perhaps discounted, the fact that Preston would be standing by the back window of the classroom cleaning soot from the lamp chimneys, having arranged this with Delia in advance. Cross was smooth. He had the manner of a man who had spent years making illegal things sound reasonable and dangerous intentions sound polite. He asked after Delia's health. He expressed condolences about Thomas, 14 months late. He mentioned Kansas City with the casual precision of someone demonstrating that he knew exactly where she had come from, and the clear implication that he could make her life there known to people in her current life, if he chose. Delia was extraordinary. She sat behind her desk and received this performance with an expression of measured cordiality. And Preston, from his position by the back window, watched her and thought that she was the most genuinely courageous person he had ever met. When Cross reached the point of his visit, which was an oblique suggestion that certain papers or letters she might have retained from Thomas's effects would be much better in Cross's keeping than in hers, and that their transfer could be arranged to everyone's considerable financial benefit, Delia said, very pleasantly, "I believe you should speak with the Marshal about any further concerns of that nature, Mr. Cross." Cross turned then, for the first time registering Preston's presence with a slight but visible shift in his posture. "Marshal," he said. "Mr. Cross," Preston said. He had set down the lamp chimney. He was standing with his thumbs in his belt and the star on his chest catching the light in the way it did when he wanted it to. "I think you should tell me more about these papers." What followed was 3 days of the careful, methodical work that Preston did exceptionally well. He sent a telegraph to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe. He made contact, through channels he had developed over 4 years of diligent professional relationships, with a territorial judge named Holloway, who had been building a case against land fraud operations across New Mexico and Texas. He quietly arranged for 2 of his most trusted deputies to maintain a presence near the boarding house. Gerald Cross, for his part, remained in Harrow Creek with the particular stubbornness of a man who has not yet decided whether to cut his losses. He drank at the Silver Pine. He played cards without notable skill. He watched the movements of Delia Larson with the kind of attention that Preston found personally offensive as well as professionally alarming. During those 3 days, something happened between Preston and Delia that was quieter than any of the external crisis, but considerably more significant. They spent long hours in his office, planning, discussing, reviewing what she knew and what he needed. She told him more of her history in those hours than she had told anyone in more than a year. She told him about Thomas, who had not been a villain in her telling but a complicated man, genuinely charming and genuinely flawed, who had made choices she had not known about until it was too late to change their consequences. She told him about the loneliness of the marriage, the years of suspecting something was wrong without having the knowledge to name it. She told him about leaving Kansas City with nothing except what she could carry, and the absolute determination not to be destroyed by what had happened to her. And Preston, who was not a man accustomed to speaking about his own interior life, found himself responding with honesty he rarely offered anyone. He told her about the years before Harrow Creek, the jobs in other towns where he had been competent and respected and remained, fundamentally, alone. He told her about the particular difficulty of being exactly who he was in exactly the time and place he found himself. The way that certain men in Harrow Creek had taken a year to look at him directly, and some never had. He told her that Harrow Creek was the first place he had stayed long enough to feel that something like belonging was possible, and that he had not been certain, until recently, what or who had tipped the balance. She had looked at him when he said that, with those changeable eyes and something open in her expression that made the room feel very small in a way that was entirely comfortable. He had not said anything else that evening. He was still being careful, but the care was getting harder to maintain. On the fourth day, a federal deputy marshal arrived from Santa Fe in response to Preston's telegraph. His name was Marshal Tate, a spare, efficient man who reviewed everything Preston had assembled and communicated privately with Delia about the evidence she had secured in Santa Fe, which was a collection of letters and documents that Thomas had passed to her in the days before his death, apparently anticipating what was coming for him. Within 24 hours of Tate's arrival, Gerald Cross was in federal custody. The arrest happened on the main street of Harrow Creek in the early evening, in front of a reasonable portion of the town's population who had gathered at the sound of raised voices. Cross, when the federal charges were read to him, looked at Delia with an expression of cold fury that Preston stepped physically between before it could settle on her. Cross was taken east. He would stand trial and, given the weight of evidence, was very unlikely to return. The danger was genuinely over. Delia stood on the boardwalk after Cross was gone and the crowd had dispersed, and Preston stood beside her, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. The evening was warm. The mountains to the north were turning purple with the sunset. A dog was barking somewhere on the far end of the street. "It is over," she said finally. "It is," he agreed. She turned to look at him, and he could see in her face the particular thing that happens when someone has been holding themselves under enormous tension for a long time, and the tension is suddenly removed. Not collapse, because she was not someone who collapsed, but a kind of profound exhale. A letting down of something that had been held up by sheer will for too long. "Thank you," she said. "I want you to know that what you have done for me, what you have been for me in these past weeks, I have never had that. I have not known what it was to have someone who, I mean to say, a person who—" She stopped. This was unusual for her, the loss of words. She was precise and articulate by habit. "I know," he said quietly. "I do not think you entirely do," she said, "but perhaps—" She paused. "Perhaps there will be time to explain it." He looked at her for a long moment in the purple evening light. "Yes," he said, "there will be time." May came and transformed Harrow Creek into something that almost justified its name. The pines on the nearby slopes deepening their green. The desert floor producing the brief, spectacular bloom that happened only in this window between the late rains and the arriving summer heat. Delia's schoolroom had a window that faced east, and in the mornings when the light was right, the whole room was filled with something that felt genuinely luminous. The nature of Delia and Preston's time together shifted after Cross's arrest in a way that was difficult to describe precisely, but impossible to miss. The careful friendship that had occupied the previous months had been strained nearly transparent by the intensity of what they had been through together, and what remained was something more honest and considerably more complicated. He still stopped by the schoolhouse in the evenings. She still saved him articles from the Santa Fe paper. The Sunday rides continued, but there was a new quality to everything, a kind of heightened awareness that sat between them like a held breath that neither of them had yet found the moment to release. He was still being careful. He was not sure why precisely. The obvious reasons had been resolved. She was free of Cross. She was free of the hidden past that had been threatening her. She was, as far as he could determine, nowhere near the broken state he might have worried about from everything she had survived. She was, in point of fact, more openly herself than he had ever seen her, as though the departure of Cross had removed a layer of restraint she had not been aware she was maintaining. But there was something he had not asked about, because the timing had not been right, and because he had not wanted to add any pressure to a situation that was already, professionally, enormously pressured. He asked finally on a Sunday ride in mid-May, beside the same stream on the same ridge where things had first shifted in him 2 months earlier. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. The question was simple, but both of them understood its weight. She had come to Harrow Creek as a woman in flight. The danger that had driven the flight was resolved. She had no formal obligation keeping her here that she could not dissolve with a letter to the school board. She could go anywhere. Delia was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the valley. Then she said, "That depends on several things." "What things?" She turned to look at him directly, with the same directness she brought to everything, the thing about her that he found simultaneously most challenging and most essential. "It depends on whether the reason I want to stay is a real reason or a reason of circumstance." He understood this. "You mean whether what you feel is genuine or the result of what we have been through together?" "Yes. I have had enough experience with choices made under extreme circumstance to be cautious about them." This was the most honest thing she had ever said to him, and it was also the most difficult. He respected it completely. He said, "That is fair." And then, because he was Preston Navarro, he added, "But I would like you to know that from my perspective, what I have come to understand about you in these past months was not created by the danger we faced. It was revealed by it. Those are different things." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. "Yes," she said softly, "I believe they are." They rode back to town without resolving anything formally, but something had been opened. A door that had been politely closed had been quietly pushed open a few inches, and the light coming through it was warm. June arrived. The heat came with it. The particular fierce, dry heat of New Mexico summer that baked the adobe walls and turned the main street to packed dust that rose in small clouds with every step. School recessed for the summer, which meant Delia had long days in a way she had not had since arriving in Harrow Creek. She used them purposefully. She spent time at Mrs. Adler's reading. She helped the doctor, a gentle older man named Dr. Ferris, organize his medical library, a project that clearly pleased him enormously, and that she clearly found genuinely interesting. She took on the project of repainting the interior of the schoolhouse, a task that gave her something physical to do, and that several townspeople, including Preston, found themselves helping with on various afternoons. It was during the repainting project, on a Thursday afternoon in late June, that something broke loose in both of them. They were working on the far wall, Delia on a step stool reaching the upper portion while Preston painted the lower section. The room smelled of whitewash and summer heat, and faintly of the cedar the schoolhouse had been built from. There was no particular reason for what happened, except that the accumulation of everything had simply reached its natural terminus. She was telling him something about a passage she had read in one of Dr. Ferris's medical books, something about the nature of persistent memory, and she was gesturing with her paintbrush as she spoke, and she lost her balance slightly on the step stool, and he caught her elbow without thinking, and the moment his hand closed around her arm, both of them stopped talking. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. The room was very quiet. There was whitewash on her right hand and a streak of it across her forearm, and her hair had come partly loose from its pin, and she was the most beautiful thing Preston Navarro had ever seen in his life, and he stopped being careful. "Delia," he said. "Yes," she said, not in answer to a question. Just yes, because it was the only true word available. He helped her down from the step stool, and she was standing in front of him, and he said, "I have been wanting to tell you something for a considerable length of time." "I know," she said. "I have been wanting to hear it for a considerable length of time." And so he told her, not in a single grand declaration, but in the careful, honest, thorough way he did everything. He told her that he had not expected her, that he had constructed a satisfactory life in Harrow Creek, and had believed it complete, and that she had arrived and made it apparent that what he had considered satisfactory had in fact been profoundly missing something. He told her that he admired her more than he had words to say, and that he was aware that admiration and love were different things, but that he did not think it was possible to feel the depth of admiration he felt for her without love being part of the foundation of it. He told her that he was not asking her for anything she was not certain of, because he would rather have exactly what they already had than risk it for something she was not ready to give. She listened to all of this with her hands clasped in front of her, and her eyes steady on his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Preston Navarro, you are without question the most genuinely decent man I have ever known in my life, and I have been in love with you since approximately the Sunday in March when you told me the country around Harrow Creek was worth seeing, and you wanted to show it to me." He stared at her. "I have also been terrified," she continued, "which is why I have been extraordinarily slow about saying so, but I think I have been cautious long enough." He was very still for a moment. Then he reached out and took her paint-streaked hand in his, very carefully, and she let him, and the afternoon light coming through the schoolhouse windows was entirely golden. July and August moved through Harrow Creek with the particular quality of time that belongs to a summer when something new and good is growing. The town noticed, because of course it did. Towns of 400 souls with a single main street always notice, and the noticing was generally kind. Mrs. Adler produced an opinion that this had been coming since January, and expressed it with the satisfaction of a woman whose predictions have been vindicated. The men at the Silver Pine ribbed Preston with the good-natured brutality of men who respect someone enormously and express it through mockery, and he absorbed it with his usual unruffled dignity, which annoyed them into escalating it, which finally made him smile, which was apparently what they had been after all along. Delia was happy. It was visible in her in a way that was different from the cautious contentment she had maintained through her first months in Harrow Creek, different from the quiet satisfaction she had expressed when the cross situation was resolved. This was something more primary. She laughed more. She moved differently, with a lightness that the children in her schoolhouse noticed and commented on when school resumed in September, with the characteristic bluntness of children who have not yet learned to moderate their observations. Preston moved through those months with the particular quality of a man who is, possibly for the first time in his adult life, genuinely at ease. He did his work. He kept the town safe. He had long dinners with Delia at the small table in Mrs. Adler's dining room and longer conversations afterward on the porch in the cooling evening air. And he read the articles she saved for him and argued about them with her, and frequently lost the arguments, which was, he had come to understand, one of the genuine pleasures of his existence. They were, in the language of the time and place, courting. It was understood. It was acknowledged. It was conducted with perfect propriety in all external respects, partly because Delia had a professional reputation to maintain in a town that employed her to educate its children, and partly because Preston had a professional reputation to maintain in a town that employed him to maintain its moral order, and partly because they were both, fundamentally, people who believed in doing things properly, even when they wanted very much to do them quickly. It was in September, on an evening that had turned cool with the first genuine suggestion of the coming fall, that Preston began seriously considering what he was going to do next. He had known, since June, what he wanted. That had not been in question. What had been in question was the how and the when, and he had been turning them over in his mind with the same methodical patience he brought to every serious problem. He wanted to ask her to marry him. He wanted to do it correctly. He wanted to do it in a way that was equal to what she was to him and to what she deserved from the moment. He had discussed it, briefly and with the utmost seriousness, with no one, because he was a private man. He had purchased, during a supply trip to Santa Fe in late September, a ring. It was a simple gold band with a small dark green stone set into it that precisely matched, as best as he had been able to judge under the imperfect lighting of the Santa Fe jewelry shop, the particular shade of Delia's eyes when she was happy. The jeweler, a meticulous older man named Mr. Abelard, had told him it was a good stone, and he appeared to mean it genuinely. He carried the ring in his coat pocket for 3 weeks while he determined the right moment. The moment arrived, or rather presented itself with the particular inevitability of things that have been long approaching, on a Saturday afternoon in mid-October. Saturdays brought Harrow Creek together in a way that the rest of the week did not. The weekly supply wagons came in. Families from the outlying ranches rode into town for provisions and news. The Silver Pine Saloon was busy from mid-afternoon. The general store was full of people comparing purchases and exchanging the accumulated information of the week past. Delia had come into town that morning to help Mrs. Adler with the preparation for a small gathering Mrs. Adler was hosting that evening, a thing Mrs. Adler called a social, which was essentially the town's polite excuse to gather formally and eat excellent food. Preston had been informed of the gathering and had accepted the invitation, as had most of the town's leadership, the doctor, the lawyer, the reverend, the school board chairman, and a dozen other prominent families. He had intended, genuinely, to ask her privately. He had planned it carefully. After the social, when they were on the porch, in the cool evening quiet, he had not planned for what actually happened, which began with a man named Victor Hale. Victor Hale was a rancher who had come into Harrow Creek that Saturday with strong opinions and a great deal of whiskey already consumed before noon, which was a combination that historically produced poor decisions. Hale had been carrying a grievance against Preston for the better part of 2 months, something about the resolution of a cattle dispute that Hale believed had been handled incorrectly, and he had been conducting a low-level campaign of resentment that most people in town had heard about and considered tedious. That Saturday, Hale found his courage and his audience simultaneously, because by mid-afternoon the Silver Pine was full, and the street outside it was busy with the Saturday crowd, and he stepped out onto the boardwalk and made a series of loud and extensively profane comments about Preston Navarro's character, competency, and fundamental right to the position he held. He made particular reference to Preston's background, using the specific vocabulary of contempt that Preston had been navigating his entire professional life, and he said it loudly enough that the whole street could hear him. The crowd that formed was the particular kind of uncomfortable crowd that forms when something ugly is being said, and no one is yet sure whether to challenge it. People stopped. People exchanged glances. A few of the coarser men on the periphery looked entertained. Preston came around the corner from his office within 2 minutes, having been informed by his deputy. He walked down the middle of the street toward Hale with the exact unhurried, deliberate stride that he used when a situation required him to be absolutely unmistakably in charge of it, and the crowd parted ahead of him. He came to a stop in front of Hale, and the full weight of his attention fell on the man, and Hale, who was drunk but not suicidal, deflated slightly under it. "Victor," Preston said. His voice was completely even. "You are going to go home now. If you want to file a formal complaint about the cattle dispute, you can do that on Monday morning at my office." Hale made 2 more loud, ugly comments, digging into the vocabulary of prejudice with the particular determination of someone who has decided humiliation beats surrender. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. 1 or 2 men at the edges started to say something, and then Delia came out of the general store. She had obviously heard the shouting. She was carrying a bundle of cloth, and she came to a stop on the boardwalk not 20 feet from where Preston and Hale were standing. And she looked at the situation and at Preston, and then at Hale, and something in her expression shifted into the same cold, clear, determined thing he had seen in the parlor at Mrs. Adler's when she had described Gerald Cross. "Victor Hale," she said, and her voice was not loud, but it carried with absolute clarity through the suddenly attentive crowd. "What you are saying is shameful, and every person on this street knows it. This man has protected this town with complete integrity and profound dedication for 4 years, and you are fortunate to have him and too stubborn to admit it." Hale opened his mouth. Delia was not finished. The cattle dispute was resolved correctly. "I was not part of it, but I know this Marshal's judgment, and I trust it without reservation, and if you were willing to think clearly instead of loudly, you would too." The silence that followed was absolute. Hale looked at Delia. He looked at Preston. He looked at the assembled population of Harrow Creek, who were looking back at him with a collective expression that contained absolutely no sympathy. He said something quietly that was either an apology or a profanity, and got back on his horse and rode out. The crowd did not immediately disperse. They stood there, still gathered, because the sudden dramatic release of tension required a moment of processing. And Preston Navarro stood in the middle of the street and looked at Delia Larson, who was standing on the boardwalk with her bundle of cloth and her magnificent, furious calm. And the ring was in his pocket, and the whole town was standing around him, and he thought, with the clarity of a man who has been patient long enough, that there was never going to be a more honest moment than this one. He crossed the distance between them in 10 deliberate steps. He reached into his coat pocket. He went down on one knee in the dirt of the main street of Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory, in front of every soul the town contained. And the ring slipped from his fingers as he opened the small cloth that held it. It hit the dirt floor of the space between them and rolled in that slow, lazy arc and settled at the toe of her boot. And the entire town went silent. And the piano player in the silver pine, who had stepped outside to see what the shouting was about, lifted both hands in startled stillness. "Delia Larson," Preston said, his voice carrying across the entire street without him raising it even a fraction. I am asking you in front of every soul in this town to be my wife." And she could not speak. The silence stretched. Preston held her gaze. His hat was in his hand. The afternoon light was very bright, and his dark eyes were completely open and vulnerable in a way that she had only seen once before. The evening in June when he had told her what she was to him, but multiplied now by the public nature of this moment, because he had done this here in front of everyone, and the risk of that was not lost on her. He had not done it to pressure her. She understood that with immediate certainty. He had done it here in front of these people, because these people had just heard ugly things said about him, and she had answered those ugly things with the truth of what she knew him to be, and this was his answer to that truth. This was him saying, publicly and without any protection whatsoever, that she was the person he chose, that she was not a private matter or a careful plan, that she was his, and he was hers, and he wanted the whole of Harrow Creek to know it. She understood all of this in the space of several seconds and still could not find her voice. The thing stopping her was not uncertainty. It was not fear of the answer. It was the sheer, overwhelming enormity of the feeling itself, the thing that arrived when she fully understood what this man had done and what this man was, and the distance she had traveled to arrive at this street in this moment. She had been a frightened woman running for her life 8 months ago. She had sat in a parlor in a boarding house and told a stranger with a Marshal star the secrets she had been carrying alone through a year of displacement and danger. She had built, one honest conversation at a time, something she had never expected to find. And it was here, in the dirt of this main street, in a small gold ring with a dark green stone, in the steady gaze of this man who was still on his knee and would wait, she knew, as long as she needed. Her eyes were full. That was the cause of the silence. She was trying not to weep in the main street of Harrow Creek, and the effort of that was the thing that had taken her voice. She picked up the ring from the dirt at her foot. She stepped off the boardwalk into the street. She reached down and took Preston's hand and brought him to his feet because she did not need him on his knee. She needed him standing beside her, and then her voice came back. "Yes," she said, and it was steady and true, and the whole street heard it. "Yes, Preston Navarro, I will marry you. With everything I have and everything I am, and every day I have left to give. Yes." He took the ring from her hand and slid it onto her finger, and his hands were completely steady. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the contained reserve that defined his public face was entirely dissolved, replaced by something unguarded and luminous and deeply, purely joyful. Harrow Creek erupted. The cheer that went up from the assembled population was loud enough to startle the horses at the hitching posts. Mrs. Adler pressed both hands to her face and said something that was not quite audible over the noise. "Dr." Ferris shook hands with the school board chairman, with the enthusiasm of a man winning a private wager. Even some of the coarser men on the periphery were clapping, because, whatever their various prejudices and limitations, they were not entirely immune to a genuine romantic victory when it was standing directly in front of them in full sunlight. Delia laughed. It was a sound of pure, uncontained happiness, and it broke across the noise of the crowd like a stone breaking the surface of still water, and Preston heard it and felt it land somewhere in his chest where it would stay for the rest of his life. "The whole town," she said to him, meaning all of this, the noise and the applause and the absolute public nature of what had just happened. "The whole town," he agreed, meaning it as the best possible version of itself. They were married 6 weeks later, in late November of 1879, in the small church at the end of Harrow Creek's Main Street, on a morning that was cold and brilliant and smelled of wood smoke and pine. Reverend Caldwell, a man of genuine warmth who had been in Harrow Creek longer than anyone except Mrs. Adler, performed the ceremony with the visible pleasure of a man who believes in what he is doing. The church was full. This was not a gathering that needed invitations in a town of 400, because everyone knew and everyone came. Mrs. Adler had organized the flowers, dried wildflowers and pine branches and sprigs of sage that filled the small interior with color and fragrance. The school board chairman had contributed his late wife's piano skills to his daughter, who played beautifully. The children from Delia's school were seated in the front rows with the exaggerated propriety of children who have been very specifically told to behave, and are trying enormously hard and mostly succeeding. Delia wore a dress that she and Mrs. Adler had made together over the past 3 weeks from deep blue wool fabric that Mrs. Adler had been saving for a special occasion, without knowing what the occasion would be. The color did something remarkable with her auburn hair and her changeable eyes, which were, on this morning, unambiguously and purely green. Preston wore his good black coat with the Marshal's star deliberately removed, because today he was not Harrow Creek's Marshal. Today, he was just a man standing at the front of a church waiting for the most important thing in his life to walk down the aisle, and the star was not part of that. She walked down the aisle without a father to give her away, because her father had died when she was 17, and she had no family remaining who was present in her life. She walked it alone, with her chin up and her eyes on Preston, and there was nothing diminished about it. There was only Delia, choosing this freely and with the full force of herself, which was the only way she had ever been capable of doing anything. Preston watched her walk toward him, and felt the thing in his chest that had been building since a Sunday morning in March expand to something so large it had no edges. The ceremony was simple and honest. The words they exchanged were the traditional words of the time, but they meant them with the particular weight of people who have earned the right to mean them. When Reverend Caldwell pronounced them married and Preston kissed his wife for the first time in front of the whole of Harrow Creek for the second time that autumn, the church produced another eruption that was arguably even louder than the one on the main street in October. The celebration that followed at Mrs. Adler's boarding house, which she had surrendered entirely for the day, lasted well into the evening. There was food in quantities that suggested the whole town had contributed. There was music from 3 separate musicians who arrived with fiddles and a banjo, and proceeded to argue amicably about what to play, and then played everything. There was dancing on the cleared floor that became increasingly enthusiastic as the evening progressed. Victor Hale was not present, but nearly everyone else was. At some point in the middle of the evening, when the music was loud and the room was warm, and the dancing was at its most energetic, Preston and Delia slipped out through the back door into Mrs. Adler's kitchen garden, which was bare now with November but quiet and cold and full of stars. They stood in the cold together, and she leaned against him, and his arms were around her, and the noise of the party inside was muffled and distant and wholly separate from this. "I want to tell you something," she said, into the warmth of his coat. "Tell me. When I came to Harrow Creek in January, I was so tired. I had been running and hiding and pretending for so long, and I told myself that Harrow Creek was just the next stop, just another temporary safe place before whatever came next." She lifted her head to look at him. "I did not believe that a life was actually possible. A real one that was mine and that I could stand up in." He looked at her in the starlight. "You gave that back to me," she said. "I want you to know that. Not the ring and not the proposal and not the rescue from Cross, though I am grateful for all of those things. You gave it back to me by simply being exactly what you are every time, without ever making me feel that what I had been through had made me less than what I was before it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You had it in you the entire time. I just stood close enough to see it clearly." She pulled him down and kissed him, in the cold kitchen garden under the November stars, and Harrow Creek went on making noise inside without them. They began their married life, in a house that Preston had been quietly preparing for the past 6 weeks, a proper house on the eastern edge of town that was larger than what he had needed as a single man, and that he had acquired with specific intentions. It had 4 rooms and a kitchen and a porch that faced the mountains, and it needed considerable work, which was something Delia appeared to view as a project rather than a hardship, and Preston viewed as a manageable challenge with adequate time. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold and occasionally fierce, and genuinely wonderful. They built their life together with the same quality that had characterized everything between them from the beginning, honestly and carefully, and with the deep attentiveness of 2 people who have learned not to take good things for granted. Delia returned to teaching in the new year with the slightly altered perspective of a married woman, which the school board had apparently not anticipated would change her approach, but which in fact changed very little, except that she was more openly herself in ways that turned out to benefit the students considerably. She introduced 2 new programs in the spring term, one focused on local natural history, using the actual landscape around Harrow Creek, and one that incorporated practical mathematics into the daily life of a working ranch community, both of which were received with considerably more enthusiasm than she had expected. Preston continued his work with the steadiness and integrity that had defined it for 4 years, with the addition of a kind of settled confidence that people in town noticed and could not quite name, but that made him, if anything, more effective. He had been, without acknowledging it directly, somewhat braced against the world for his entire adult life in Harrow Creek, maintaining his position through sheer excellence, because he was not entirely certain of his footing. The certainty that Delia had given him, the absolute unconditional nature of her regard, had loosened something in him that he had not known was held tight. He was also, and this was observed with great entertainment by the residents of Harrow Creek, considerably more likely to smile. In March of 1880, exactly 1 year after the Sunday ride on which everything had shifted between them, Delia told him she was pregnant. She told him on the porch of their house, in the early morning before the day had fully begun, with the mountains visible to the north and the first spring birds audible in the pines. She told him with the particular mixture of joy and solemnity that belongs to people who know, from their own histories, that not everything precious is guaranteed. Preston sat with this information for the length of time it took to fully register. Then he stood up from his chair and crossed the porch to her and held her with a carefulness that made her laugh softly against his chest. "I am not fragile," she told him. "I know," he said. "I am." She laughed again, and he pressed his face against her hair and felt the full weight of this. A year ago he had been a man who had constructed a satisfactory life and believed it complete. He could not now describe, in any language that would fully carry it, the distance between what he had thought he had and what he actually had. November of 1880 brought them a son. He arrived, as all arrivals do, with his own schedule and on his own terms, in the middle of a crisp autumn night while the whole of Harrow Creek was asleep, and Dr. Ferris was awake and deeply professional, and Mrs. Adler was in the kitchen making coffee because she could not be present in the room, but she absolutely could not be at home. The boy was healthy and emphatic about making this known to everyone within hearing distance. Preston, who had been in the kitchen with Mrs. Adler during the final hour, having been gently but firmly invited to leave the room by Dr. Ferris, came back in when he was summoned and stood at the bedside and looked at Delia, who was exhausted and thoroughly disheveled and more beautiful than he had ever seen her, and at the small person she held, who was very new and very certain of his own importance. "Hello," Delia said to the baby, in the tone of someone beginning a conversation. The baby opened his eyes briefly, assessed the situation, and appeared satisfied with it. They named him James Thomas Navarro. The Thomas was for Thomas Larson, not in forgiveness of his mistakes, but in acknowledgement of the complicated human being he had been, and of the chain of events that had, ultimately, brought Delia to Harrow Creek. The James was for no one in particular except that it suited him. James Navarro was, from the very beginning, a person of strong and specific opinions. He was determined. He was vocal. He was, at approximately 8 months old, entirely convinced that he could walk, and practiced this ambition with the stubborn persistence of someone who regards falling as merely a temporary setback. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's auburn hair, and the particular quality of absolute attention that both of his parents brought to everything, which made him, even as a very small child, someone you could not easily ignore. Harrow Creek absorbed James Navarro as it had absorbed his parents, with the proprietary affection of a small community that claims its own. Mrs. Adler held him with the authority of an appointed grandmother and brooked no argument on this point. Dr. Ferris followed his development with professional interest. The children in Delia's school treated him as a communal project when she occasionally brought him to the schoolroom, which had the unintended benefit of teaching her older students the fundamentals of infant care, whether they had any immediate use for the knowledge or not. The year 1881 passed with the particular richness of a time when a great deal is happening that is simply the business of living well. Preston dealt with the routine and occasionally extraordinary challenges of keeping a growing frontier town in reasonable order. Delia's school expanded enough to require a second teacher, which she selected with considerable care, and with the pleasant realization that she was now the kind of established professional educator whose recommendations carried weight. James learned to walk at 11 months, slightly ahead of schedule and entirely consistent with his evident character. In the spring of 1882, Delia told Preston she was pregnant again. This second announcement was received on the same porch as the first, as though the porch had become the official location for significant revelations, and Preston received it with the warmth and certainty of a man who has made peace with his own good fortune. "You are not going to be careful to the point of paralysis this time," Delia observed. "I am not going to be careful to the point of paralysis," he agreed. He paused. "I make no other promises." She smiled. He had not, in fact, become entirely uncautious during the first pregnancy. He had simply directed his caution into practical channels, which amounted to checking in on her approximately twice as frequently as was probably necessary, and reading every medical text that Dr. Ferris possessed with the focused attention of a man preparing for a complicated assignment. Dr. Ferris had found this both touching and mildly exhausting. September of 1882 brought their second child, a daughter. She arrived in the early evening with less drama than her brother, with a quality of quiet determination that turned out to accurately predict her character. They named her Clara Rosalie Navarro, and from the beginning she was a different kind of person than James, watchful where he was vocal, methodical where he was impulsive, with a smile that she distributed with an economic precision that made it feel, every time, like a genuine gift. James, now approaching 2 years old, received the announcement of a sister with the deep suspicion of a child who has been the exclusive center of considerable attention and has strong feelings about alterations to this arrangement. He spent approximately 1 week being doubtful about Clara, after which he apparently made a private reassessment and adopted a posture of protective authority over her that he maintained with absolute consistency from that point forward, and that was, in its way, completely consistent with both of his parents. Harrow Creek in 1882 was a different place in some respects from the Harrow Creek of 1879. The railroad had finally come through, not directly but close enough that a spur line connected the town to the main route 40 miles west. This brought new commerce and new people, and the particular complicated energy of a place that is growing faster than its existing infrastructure and social structures can comfortably absorb. There were more disputes. There were more strangers arriving. There were more opportunities for the kinds of conflicts that required Preston's particular skills. He handled the changes as he handled everything, with methodical attention and the capacity to distinguish what mattered from what merely appeared to matter. He expanded his deputy staff. He developed a relationship with the new railroad security officers that was professionally cooperative rather than territorially competitive, which required some delicate navigation, but produced considerably better outcomes than the alternative. He was, in the terms of his time and place, an exceptional lawman, and the town was aware of this and increasingly willing to say so. Delia watched him do his work and felt, with the regularity of breathing, the same thing she had felt standing on the main street the day Hale had said ugly things and Preston had walked toward the situation with absolute steady dignity. She had told him that she loved him in a schoolroom that smelled of whitewash in June of 1880. But the truth was that she had loved him since before that, since March, since the first Sunday ride, since the moment he had sat across his cluttered desk and listened to her describe a broken window with her full attention as though it were the most important thing he had ever heard. She had been loved before, in the complicated, incomplete way that Thomas Larson had been capable of loving anyone. This was different. This was the kind of love that was built rather than declared, that accumulated like the light in the schoolhouse at the beginning of the school day, filling the room from the east window until everything was illuminated. It was not dramatic, except when it was. It was mostly just true. It was the most reliable thing in her life, and she intended it to remain so. In the spring of 1884, they spent a Sunday afternoon on the ridge above the valley where the horses had once drunk from the shallow stream, and Preston had first understood what he was feeling. James was 3½ and had been allowed to ride with considerable ceremony on the front of his father's saddle. Clara was 18 months and was held by Delia with the practiced ease of a mother who has long stopped worrying about perfect management and settled for effective management. They stood at the edge of the ridge in the late afternoon light, the mountains to the north still wearing the last of the winter white, the valley below beginning its spring green, and the sky enormous above them the way it always was out here. The way it had been that first afternoon when Delia had looked out over the distance with an expression of unguarded peace. She had that expression now. She had it often now, the put-down weight, the genuine ease of someone who has found where she belongs. James declared that he could see all the way to Santa Fe, which was not remotely true but entirely characteristic, and Preston told him that was a good effort, and perhaps he needed to look a little more to the left, which occupied the boy for several more minutes of serious squinting at the horizon. Clara, from her position in Delia's arms, reached out and grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair with the absolute conviction of a child who considers this entirely appropriate. And Delia extracted her hair with the practiced resignation of someone who has negotiated this particular interaction dozens of times and has made peace with it. "She has your grip," Delia told Preston. "She has your determination," he said. "Those are the same observation from different angles." He smiled at her, the full, open smile that had always felt like something given specifically to her, and she felt it land in exactly the same place it always landed, and thought that some things did not become ordinary no matter how often they occurred. This was one of them. The town below them was visible, the small cluster of buildings along the main street, the church spire, the new buildings that had gone up around the railroad spur. Smoke from evening fires beginning to rise, the last of the afternoon light on the adobe walls. It was theirs, in the way that places become yours not through ownership, but through the accumulation of everything that has happened in them. The road she had come down on the stage in January of 1879, with her one trunk and her one bag and her careful expression. The schoolhouse with its eastern window. The boarding house parlor where she had told a stranger her secrets. The main street where a ring had rolled in the dirt and a man had waited on his knee with his whole heart visible. All of it theirs. All of it real. All of it the life she had not believed was possible, standing here under the enormous New Mexico sky, fully and completely actual. James had turned from the horizon and was now attempting to determine whether it was possible to climb down from the saddle unassisted, which Preston intercepted with a smoothness born of practice. Clara had relinquished her grip on Delia's hair and was watching the mountains with the focused attention of a child who is processing something large. "We should head back before the light goes," Delia said. "We should," Preston agreed. He lifted James down from the saddle and set him on his feet, and watched him immediately begin investigating a nearby patch of scrub with the scientific enthusiasm of a small child, whose relationship to personal safety is aspirational at best. Delia settled Clara more securely against her hip and turned toward the horses. Preston stood for a moment at the edge of the ridge, looking out over the valley and the town below it, the way he had stood 4 years ago looking at her with the reins of both horses in his hand and the knowledge of what he felt settling in him like a key turning in a lock. The same town. The same sky. A completely different life than anything he had known to want before she arrived in it. He called James back from the scrub. He helped Delia with Clara while she mounted, then lifted James up in front of her and checked the buckle on his saddle and took his own reins and turned the horse toward the trail. "Preston," Delia said from beside him. He looked at her. "I am very glad you told me the country was worth seeing," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the last of the afternoon light, and the thing that had no edges and no end moved in him the way it always did. "So am I," he said. "So am I." They rode down from the ridge in the golden hour, their children settled and warm between them. The town of Harrow Creek spread below them in the early evening quiet, the mountains watching from the north the way they always had, unchanged and enormous and patient. The trail wound down through the scrub and the young spring growth, the horses finding their footing with the confidence of animals that knew this path. And by the time they reached the flat approach to the town, the evening star had appeared in the western sky above the last edge of the sun. James had fallen asleep in the saddle, propped against Delia with his head on her arm, the complete trusting collapse of an exhausted child. Clara was awake and quiet against her father's chest, watching the first star with her careful, attending gaze. They rode into Harrow Creek on the main street, past the general store and the Silver Pine and the Marshal's office and the schoolhouse at the far end, past Mrs. Adler's boarding house where a lamp was burning in the parlor window, past the church where the small cross caught the last light. They rode home. The house on the eastern edge of town had its porch light burning, because Delia had developed the habit of leaving it lit when they went out in the evenings, so that coming back always looked like arriving somewhere that was waiting for you. The mountains were invisible now in the dark, but they were there, where they had always been, and the night was cold and clear and full of stars. Preston took both horses to the small stable while Delia carried the sleeping James inside, and by the time he came through the door, she had him in his bed and was settling Clara in her cradle by the stove warmth, and the house was warm and lit and fully, quietly, completely itself. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched her straighten from the cradle, and she turned and saw him, and her expression was exactly what it always was, open and steady and certain, the expression of a woman who has put down every carried weight and found, in the putting down, that what remained was all she had ever needed. Outside, the night deepened over Harrow Creek. The stars multiplied in the vast New Mexico sky. The mountains stood in the dark, patient and permanent. The town settled into its evening quiet, the small sounds of people moving through their lives in the last hours before sleep, the distant music from the silver pine, a dog somewhere calling into the night and receiving no particular answer. And in a house on the eastern edge of that town, two people who had each carried so much and come so far stood in the warm light of a kitchen and looked at each other with the unhurried certainty of people who have arrived somewhere they do not intend to leave. It was, in the fullest and most complete sense of the word, enough. It was, in every way that mattered and all the ways they had never dared to plan for, exactly right.